Quad66. Alright, let's check out some gyros and compare them. So I've got the Tune RC board over here, which has got that BMI270 gyro, and then I've got the Flywoo board here. This is an F411 board with the MPU6000 gyro. And I've got the boards built up onto very, very similar quads. Both of the quads have the Warpig 114 frame. Both of the quads are built up with the Flywoo 1202.5 motors. These are 11,500 kV. Both of them have nice fresh GemFan 2512s, and flying them both on 2S GNB Yellow Label 530 batteries. Both have the Warpig printed TPU canopies. There is a little camera difference here where on the Tune RC build with the BMI, I've got a 199C camera versus on the MPU6000 Flywoo board, I've got a Cadixant light, so a slight difference there. They're both on Happy Model EP2 receivers. They're both on Nameless RC Nano VTXs. There is a capacitor difference where the Flywoo board, it's got this big 35 volt 220 UF microfarad capacitor, and on the Flywoo board, I forget exactly what it was. Can I see it? I can't see the markings, but I think it's maybe like a 16 volt or something along those lines, and I think it's also like a 220. So it's important to note that when we dive into these black box logs, this is not like absolutely the ideal testing conditions, because there's variables here which could throw off the differences. But more what I was interested to see is, hey, based on what we know about these gyros, are we going to see the expected behavior? And I think generally speaking, we kind of do. This isn't necessarily a post to say that one gyro is better than the other. It's more to look at, okay, if you're looking at different boards, what are you going to think about doing the same or different? Do you need to do anything different? And I think overall, what I'm seeing in the black box logs kind of supports what's sort of been reported out already to some degree with what's been, when people have looked at these different gyros and compared them. And I think it's important to put this data point out there, as imperfect as it is, because what you really want to know is not just one example of each gyro in perfect conditions compared. Although that's good, what you really want to know is, 100 examples of the BMI, 100 examples of the MPU, and you want to see multiple examples and see what the overall trends are. So the way I would look at this is actually look at the data that we're going to go through the black boxes here, and then take that and integrate it with what you're seeing from other people putting up about these different gyros and what to expect. All right, let's move over onto the laptop and take a look at these logs. All right, let's jump into the black box logs here. So I'm going to start off with the Flywoo board. So that's the F411, and it's got the MPU6000. It's running 8K, 4K, and it is important to think about that 4K when you think about the logging and when we're thinking about noise. And so the way I have this set up is I kind of want to show you both of these at the same time for convenience, but normally I would look at my traces, like in terms of my tracking kind of setup here, and then my noise setup here in separate panels, so that way it's bigger and kind of a little bit easier to see, but just for convenience I'm kind of stacking them together here. This is what I'm calling like a final tune for this build, and so it's going to fly really well. So if we look at these like snap rolls, we've got the set point in yellow, and it's following this, and the gyro in red is following that set point. What we want to see is that it's right on set point throughout the snap roll. Looks pretty good. It's just having just a tiny bit of struggle hanging on at the tail end of the snap roll there. And this is true when we look at several examples of snap rolls. And then when we go over into the twitch moves, we can see that we have a nice balance here. When we're looking at the twitch moves, we're not jumping off early, so if we've got too much feed forward or P, you're going to have it kind of jump out here. If you don't have enough, it's going to kind of like lose the tracking over here. And in these cases, when we're looking at the twitch moves, the tracking stays nice and on. Even when I get into some pretty aggressive twitch moves, it stays looking pretty good. The other thing we scan through real quick too is just look for any problem spots, some bad gyro data. And where you want to look for that the most is kind of at the start, like when you kind of blip the throttle and go into a snap roll. We don't see any big like kind of janky signal through here. And when we scroll across multiple of these, we don't see that. So generally speaking, I'm not going to go through this entire tune in detail, but this is pretty good looking tune. It is a little bit on the edge. This particular setup, to really get the set point tracking dialed in, you can see I'm pretty high on the P's, like 90, 89, 90. Pretty high on the D in the 60s, and feed forward pretty high, 250. So it takes a lot to get this quad to fly well, but once you get it flying well, it really does fly well. This quad is a little bit prone to this prop wash sort of oscillation. So what happens is, as you're kind of coming into prop wash, the prop wash kind of kicks in and you get this little bit of an oscillation because this is an on the edge tune. But on this particular one here, this is not doing too bad. But you can see a little bit more of that prop wash here, where that's the one place where this quad is just a little bit weaker. That's just a sort of a function of tri-blade props in general. They're a little bit worse with prop wash, I've found, just in general, at least on my builds compared to the bi-blade props. So on the MPU6000, let's think about now the noise here. And so in general, what we're going through is the gyro scaled, you know, it's there, and I'm going to pull up some graphs of it, but it's really small. To really see the noise, we have to look at the D term. And so that's going to be the D term on the roll in yellow and D term on pitch in purple. And what you're looking for is an excessive amount of what I call these kind of like D term blooms. So as I hit the throttle, you can sometimes trigger these kind of like bloom of little D term noise. And as we scroll through, this actually looks pretty good. We've got these little, you know, a little bit, but nothing major, nothing crazy. And so that to me is looking overall like a pretty nice balance between handling and noise, and you know, our motors aren't going to get hot or have any problems like that. In terms of graphing this out so you can see the noise a little bit better, this is going to be the gyro scaled on roll. And we don't see any problems here down low. Basically, there's maybe a little bit of scattering, some of this like prop wash and other stuff coming in. The motor band noise not really bad at all, and up high we don't see anything too bad. And again, the gyro scale is never going to look terrible. You basically don't want to see a whole lot here, because when you're going to see it, especially on these tunes, where you're going to see it the most is when you magnify it with the D term. So now you can see that when we brought in the D term, our filtering is actually doing a very good job over here in kind of the motor band range. Down low, this is a little bit noisier than I would like, but you know, it sort of is what it is. And up high, there's a little bit, nothing terrible out here. You know, the filtering's kicking in up high, and we're not seeing any problems up there on the roll. On the pitch, similar story down low, a little bit noisier possibly than we like, but the filtering's doing really well as we get into that motor band. We do have this one funny little bump out here, but really this is not really going to cause you any problems in handling, and overall this isn't too bad. Now we do the frequency versus throttle to get our waterfall plots. And so in general, what I've seen once you're applying kind of my tunes to these MPU6000 is, in general, down low, I kind of get this, there's no one bad problem, like there's no frame resonance, there's no battery wiggling, but I just generally have kind of this haze down here of just kind of low frequency noise, just a little hazy. But then you can see as we get into the throttle bands, the motor bands, there's nothing bad there, no big frame resonance. And then on the pitch, I think we're on the pitch already, we see the one little funny spot there. Let's go back over to the roll. It's a little bit less on the roll. But overall, to me, this looks good. This looks like, you know, if anything, you could potentially even back off the filtering here just a little bit and maybe pick up a little bit better handling of that prop wash. So let's kind of have that in mind as sort of our benchmark. And now we're going to go over to the BMI270. So BMI270, this is the same exact tune and same exact filtering applied. And so scrolling through up top, we're going to kind of look at our couple things we want to look at. So as we get up into max punch out, a little bit of an oscillation, but not terrible. I personally tolerate this and don't worry about it too much because I'm not really at max throttle all that much, so I don't really care about that quite as much. But if that's something that bothers you, a little bit of TPA or thrust linearization can help clean that up and take that down. Now, when we're coming, so this is punch out, right? Then you got to come down, and so you're going to get into some dirty air here. And so what we want to look through is, how is this doing once we get into the dirty air? In general, the logs kind of go along with my sort of perception that this particular quad with the BMI270 just gets a little bit easier to upset it in terms of the prop wash and get into this little oscillation here. Nothing terrible, but it's enough to be a little like, not quite as good. Also, when we kind of scan through this, but so yeah, maybe not as good, but it's not terrible either. It's really not bad. But when I scan through, one of the things I'm looking through here as we look at the D-term noise, there's just generally a little bit more of it in terms of seeing. Yeah, so here they come out. So we've got these kind of bigger D-term blooms where that noise is kind of getting kicked off. And we just see more of this, as we scroll through. Now, in terms of the set point tracking, I think it's really good. And I would call it on par with the MPU6000, with the caveat that occasionally sometimes it just bobbles a little bit more. I don't see any bad gyro type data here, but in general, this quad was just having a little bit harder time on some of these, but it's just some of them. You can see that some of these snap rolls, it's going to track just fine, but occasionally, see that one looks good too, occasionally it just has a slightly harder time. Whether you chalk that up to a little bit of different flying versus the actual quad having a little bit difference, I'm not sure. In terms of the twitch moves, again, this quad actually looks good, and I think it's on par with the other one. Maybe we're seeing a little more of a hint of the so that's the gyro trace kind of jumping out ahead of the set point. So maybe we're a little bit aggressive here, and then maybe we're picking up little hints of it not holding on to these twitch moves quite as well. But this is really subtle. This is within, other factors that you have to consider is like, okay, are these motors totally the same? And in this case, there's some reason to think that they're not. I'm seeing a little bit difference in some of the motor traces, and I'll kind of follow that up with some additional videos. But whether this is the gyro or just a little bit difference in the quad, hard to say. But it's on par. It's not. I wouldn't go and point this out and say this is notably worse. From flying it, the one thing I would say that maybe it's a little bit different is it's a little bit more susceptible to some of this prop wash induced kind of bobble. So now let's take a look at the noise and compare that. So let's pull this one up here. So let's compare. So this is the MPU6000. Let's get our plot up here for the noise, and let's start with the regular plot. I'm going to pull up that same plot here on the BMI270. So we're starting on gyro scaled. And so what I'm seeing in general, so one of the things I had to point out too is on this, to get these sort of more lined up, I had to move this slider a little bit because on the MPU6000, this is going to go all the way up to 1,000 hertz versus on the BMI270, it's going to stop at 800. And that's the difference between logging at 4, with the gyro or the PID loop running at 4K versus on the MPU6000 versus 3.2K on the BMI270. But so when we look at this, looking down here, it's pretty hard. This baseline is so low, so it's pretty hard to say whether on the gyro traces this looks any different, but this does look clean. Down low, this does look good. And then also up high, this looks really clean too, with maybe a little bit less control over through here with the motor band noise. And the same kind of thing we can see also on the pitch, where on the BMI270, come on computer, down low this looks really clean, maybe struggling a little bit more in the motor band, and then up high it's really clean. Comparing that to the MPU6000, sorry, wrong one. Let's get the gyro scaled. Down low, I think this noise baseline is just a little bit higher, and then up here we see some more problems with more noise up high, but through the motor bands doing really well. So let's exaggerate this now. Let's look at the D term. And so this is the MPU6000. So remember here, I was saying that this to me looks a little bit noisier than it possibly could, but doing really well through the motor band, and then up high, doing okay. Now, BMI 270, interesting enough, so let's go ahead and pull up that D term. And so right away what kind of jumps out at me is, yes, it's not controlling here through this motor band as well, but up high, look how clean that is. That's super clean up high. And then I think when we look down low, this to me actually looks better than the MPU6000. This kind of noise floor in these low frequencies, I think do look better on the BMI270. Thinking about that, why is this going to be better here and we're doing better out here, but why are we not doing as well in the motor bands? And let's actually, before we kind of get into my speculation here, let's pull up the waterfall plots just to visualize this one more way and make sure we're not getting fooled. So on these waterfall plots, pay attention to this area in here. So do you see how this kind of just has this haziness here? So this is the MPU6000 with that haziness. Look at the BMI. The BMI is really, I think it truly is cleaner down here in these low frequencies, at least on these two builds. Now, part of what you have to consider is that on the BMI, we're only logging at 3.2 versus 4, or the PID loop is running at 3.2 versus 4. So some of the difference that we might be seeing may be because we just have more data coming in here, so there's more data, more noise, and that might be part of the difference. But this, for the BMI270, this does look good down low. I think we have down low, I think we have a really good separation between the signal and the noise. And I think that in this example, I think the separation between the signal and the noise is not as good on the MPU6000 down low as it is on the BMI270. Now the story changes as we get up into the motor band. And I think the reason for that is if we think of the built-in low-pass filtering. So the built-in low-pass filtering in a BMI270 gyro, the cutoff level for that is somewhere around 300. So if we have a low-pass filter, it's going to start filtering. It's not going to start filtering until we get to 300. So you can see we're already into the motor band. And then by the time it really kicks in, we're getting up here close to 500 hertz. So by the time that low pass filter is kicking in, it's up here. And now look at the difference up here in this high frequency stuff. Is that I think this is really interesting with the MPU6000. The low pass filtering built into the MPU6000, it kicks in lower. It kicks in at 255, and so I think you're getting more control through the motor band due to that. But then look up high. Whether that's because this gyro just in general has a higher noise floor, or maybe the low-pass filtering they have built in is working a little bit differently, where on the MPU6000 it seems like it kicks in earlier, but doesn't have the same attenuation up high that the BMI270, or maybe the BMI270 just has a lower noise floor in general. And so then by the time the low-pass filtering kicks in, it just really wipes it out. Look, I mean, this is like dark black over here. So that kind of led to my next question of well, although I have the same Betaflight filtering on both of these quads, am I giving the BMI270 a fair shake? Because if it has less low-pass filtering baked in, then maybe it doesn't have the same latency as the MPU6000. So maybe when we're trying to do this direct apples-to-apples comparison with using the same Betaflight filtering, maybe we're actually giving the MPU6000 kind of a leg up. So one of the things I did was think about that and say, well, how can we even this up if that's what's actually going on here? And so one of the things I did is I said, well, what if we go ahead and take the BMI 270 and we use the D-term slider to kind of match up that same low pass cutoff. Now it's on the D-term and not everything, so this is not really apples to apples, but I'm trying to do some things to kind of match it up. And these are some of the ideas I had with this. And so now what you see is what I did is I went ahead and moved the D-term slider so that the cutoff for the statics low-pass filter on the D-term is 255 to match that what we see in the MPU6000 versus on the MPU6000, I've got that low pass filter, and I had on both of them initially, but look at the low pass filter where the cutoff is 300. So now I've kind of like flipped it by saying, well, I can't change the MPU6000 built-in filter, but what I can do is I can add more D-term filtering on the BMI270 so that we've got a low-pass filter cutoff now in the D-term to match the low-pass filter cutoff built into the MPU6000. So does that work? Sort of. So let's get this graph up here. It sort of helped, but not as much as I would have hoped. So let's get just matching graphs up here. So we'll do frequency versus throttle. And so it's like, yeah, if we look at this, you can see that this bright spot here, we're definitely knocking that down. So that low pass filter, that D term, that's helping. That's really knocking this down. And is it quite as good as the MPU6000 through here? No, it doesn't fully match it. But it does, I think it does even it up. And then so now you're arguing between, I think, something that's a little bit more equivalent. So with the MPU6000, you are worse down low, better through the motor band, and then worse up high, compared to something that theoretically maybe we have the same latency here where the BMI is cleaner down low, worse through the motor band, and then better up in the high frequencies. So kind of pick your poison. Now, in terms of thinking about, is this a fair kind of like way to even them up? Maybe, maybe not. And the way I was kind of trying to judge that is then coming through here and thinking about, okay, well, when I do that, how much of the, like, you know, the problem with adding latency is, am I going to start to lose more control over this like little prop wash jiggle, you know, a little prop wash oscillation? And it's hard to really quantify this and be real objective about it, but my sense was that I felt like this became a little bit more touchy and a little bit more prone to getting these little prop wash oscillations. And so in my personal take on this, although this quad sounded cleaner, it sounded good, I wouldn't make that trade-off personally because I noticed this more than I did the other characteristics of the quad. So then I kept thinking about it and thinking, well, okay, maybe if that doesn't get us to where you know, it's a truly fair fight or equal these up, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I thought about, well, can we take advantage of the BMI270, what we're doing with it in terms of filter, and use some of the advantages of the more, what I call like kind of the smarter filters, the more targeted filters like RPM filter and the dynamic notches. And so what I did in this case is I said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to turn off, in this case, we're going to fully turn off the gyro low pass filtering. So that top slider, we're just going to knock it out entirely because we're not doing that 8K, 4K thing. We don't have to worry about aliasing. And then also if we kind of count up and say, well, how much room do we have to push the filters up and make them equal? And I don't know, there's not a great way to equal that up in terms of latency, but I was kind of thinking if we move, and I'm using the UAV Tech, he's got this spreadsheet that kind of estimates latency. I was kind of estimating if we try and even this up by giving the BMI a little bit more RPM filter. So now what I'm doing, let me actually show you over here. I know what my little code means, but I think you'll understand this better here. So if we look at the RPM filter, normally I like flying with a narrow queue of 750, but I thought, well, what if we give this queue, what if we spread these RPM notches out so it's a broader queue, and so let's give it, instead of doing 750, let's let it go wider to 500, and then on the dynamic notch, instead of using just one of these, why don't we give it two of these? And if you use that U of A Tech, maybe sometimes this is going to kind of even them up. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. So now, I think this gets interesting because let's pull up this plot now of the noise. All right. So now look at this. This is this is kind of beautiful. I'm going to flip over the MPU6000 back to this regular plot here. So we're still on the MPU6000. It's still doing a little better through the motor band here. I think it's still doing a little bit better through the motor band, but I think we're better down low, and we're certainly better up high. Take a look at this. Down low, up high. BMI270, down low, up high. So it's a little bit of trade-off. It's like better, a little worse, definitely better. And when we look at, let's go back to the waterfall plots. So down low, kind of keep that in your mind on the MPU6000. You got this kind of haze through there. MPU6 or the BMI270, that's definitely cleaner. Motor bands, yes, I would kind of give that to the MPU6000 maybe, but there's just less haze overall. Look, I mean, just, you know, there's less of that red haze. And then up high, BMI270, this is definitely doing better than MPU6000. And I think this might be fairly equal latency. I could be wrong. I totally could be. Hopefully I'm not too far off. And the way I kind of try and like sort that out is whether the latency is bad or not is looking at these like little prop wash bobbles. And when I'm looking at it, this quad, so when I fly this quad with these settings, this is super clean. It sounds really clean in the air, but I do think it's a little bit more sensitive to these prop wash bobbles. We can see them as we kind of scroll through. I think you just get a little bit more of it. So this is kind of an interesting strategy, though, in terms of the BMI270, where you're gonna lean less on the low pass filtering, but you're gonna give it more. You know, you're gonna give it a wider Q in the RPM, and you're gonna give it more dynamic notches, and you know, maybe that evens them up. And for some people, I think they actually might like this strategy a lot for the BMI270. This quad really, on these settings, sounds just really clean and beautiful. Me personally, I'm more into kind of the feel of the quad itself, though, in terms of like the little prop wash bobbly stuff kind of bothers me more. So I personally probably wouldn't fly this. What was kind of interesting about this is that using this filtering strategy, I thought my response to the snap rolls was actually probably a little more consistent. I wouldn't say on the good ones it's any better, but it seemed less prone to kind of bobbling on those snap rolls. And then similar thing to where when I'm looking at the twitch response, let me scroll down here to the twitches, I think it cleaned up just a touch of that twitch also. So, you know, it's just kind of some thought for you. If you're not really bothered a lot by this, you know, prop wash kind of bobbly stuff here, if that's not something that bothers you too much, this might be an interesting strategy for you to consider, kind of evening things up compared to like our baseline BMI270. So then I thought, well, okay, that's interesting. What if we experiment? Let me see. We're just looking at that one. What if we experiment with that BMI270? What if we go and say, let's take that low pass filter instead of the normal setting, so the new normal. So Betaflight takes it off its default and moves it down to that 300 cutoff. What if we use option 1, which actually raises that low pass filter cutoff to 550? So what we're going to do is here say, well, let's decrease the low pass filtering on board in that built-in low pass filter on the gyro itself. And then let's lean even heavier on the Betaflight filtering, where we're going to have this Q of 500, and let's now do 4 dynamic notches. And instantly on this quad, I just had bad stuff. And let's find it down here, where it's just like, look at this, it's just like boom, boom, boom. This is like, this quad is not happy. And I'm thinking, what did I do? Like, why was this quad so unhappy? And then it hit me, and I realized, okay, I'm kind of an idiot. So what I did is I added 2 more dynamic notches, but I restricted them. I kept them in that restricted range from like 150 to 600. So as soon as you go above 600, now you don't have that same low pass filtering kicking in, and you're not letting the dynamic notches go up here and make up that gap. So you're leaving this gap open, this window open for this bad stuff to happen in the high frequency. So I kind of had to laugh at myself for that, and I thought, okay, well, let's try that again. And so this time, the same strategy here with the low pass filters at 550. Got my RPM Q at 500, and I'm running 4 dynamic notches at a Q of 300. And this was kind of an interesting strategy. This actually flew really well. Noise-wise, it does not do as well when you look at the plots, but prop wash handling here was actually pretty good. I thought that was kind of interesting where, to me, the low-pass filters seem to have more negative impact on the prop wash than using these dynamic notches and adding dynamic notches. So you can oversee, or just in general, see that we're again doing worse in that motor band. We'll look at this waterfall plot where it looks good down low. We're getting some more haziness. You can see we're getting some haziness up high. So that kind of proves my idea to some degree that on the BMI board, that once that low-pass filter kicks in, it's really cutting hard and it's really taking out that high-frequency noise really well once it kicks in. Once we push that cutoff to 550, it's getting pretty high before that low-pass filter is really starting to cut in. And so what I had to do is I had to stretch out, let the dynamic notches go all the way up to 1,000 hertz. And then once we did that, this started to work pretty well. So not as well controlled through the motor band. And what's kind of interesting is that down low, it doesn't look quite as clear. Like, look at this of... what I'm kind of seeing is that there's some correlation between high and low, where... where's our best one here? Let's look at this. When we get control throughout, especially kind of up high through the motor band, then you really control down low too, because I think some of this kind of feeds in, some of this high frequency stuff can kind of trickle back into that lower frequency stuff. And so I think when you're trying this strategy out here where you're saying, let's decrease the low pass filtering, let's tolerate some of this high frequency kind of hazy stuff, you're going to get a little bit more haze down low too, even though theoretically there's no filtering going down here. So I thought that's kind of interesting how this high frequency kind of can bleed into some of the lower frequency. But this quad did fly well on these settings. So using that high low pass filter of 550, that's option 1 on Betaflight, I don't know, it flew good. I kind of liked it. Do you see that bobble there? But the prop wash, so you can see it here where, look how it really just, it doesn't get perturbed by that prop wash nearly as much. And that was kind of nice. I kind of like that. So that was kind of interesting. Something for you to consider. See, here's another little prop wash example. See, yeah, it's just keeping it tight and in check. So that was kind of interesting. What else did I try? Did I try anything else interesting? I tried one other thing. I said, well, okay, if this is doing so well. So I said, okay, if our higher low-pass filter is doing well at, in terms of that prop wash and stuff like that, can we tolerate a little more latency and bring in a little bit more filtering from the RPM filter, and is that going to end up in a good place? So there's more stuff to experiment here. This is where I stopped experimenting, because after this I sort of lost my discipline and went ahead and smashed the quad and dinged up some motors and things like that. So, but what I thought about here is, let's use this high low pass filter setting. Well, the middle one actually, it's option 1. Now let's use an RPM filter Q. Let's make it even wider, 450. Now you're saying 500 versus 450. That's like hardly any difference at all. Well, the thing about the filters is the difference in latency gets dramatically higher as we get into the lower numbers. So the difference from 750 to 500 is kind of similar to going from 500 to 450, interestingly enough. Maybe not that dramatic, but that's kind of the general idea. So still got 4 dynamic notches, and now our RPM filter Q went down to 450. And did this help us out? So in terms of looking at the D-term noise, give this a second to pull up. I wasn't overly impressed. I didn't think it really helped a ton. Let me look at the waterfall. So let's pull both of these up so we have them both. So here, 500, 450. You know, to me that's kind of like in the margin of error. Now if you kept pushing this, maybe if you go down to 400 or 300, you're going to start to see some difference. But as you do that, at some point in time, you're going to introduce enough latency where you're going to start bringing that prop wash bobble back out. This still looked okay, I think, on these settings. You know, not super prone. We see a little bit. It's not doing anything bad. But so that's kind of another strategy you can consider. I haven't fully worked out. Basically, I want to get BMI. I want to get more BMI boards, and I want to put them on more builds. But when we start thinking about our BMI filtering strategies, I think we have some interesting options based on the build in terms of thinking about, okay, where's our problem? And because we have some more control over that low-pass filter, we can start making some different choices of saying, well, maybe we want to lean more on the RPM filter. Maybe we want to lean more on the dynamic notches. Or do we kind of want to use that baked-in low-pass filter? Now, there is some reason to think that the built-in low-pass filters may be more effective than doing them through Betaflight, because basically, when you're talking about the speed of electronics and how fast they can work, proximity matters and the type of memory matters. And I haven't looked at the details of this, but basically, like, if you have to send a signal from one place to another, that distance matters because, you know, the signal has to travel. So if you can do all that just, so let's say this box is the gyro here, and over here we got our processor on the board. And just for an example, if you can keep all the signals in here and not have to move it all the way over here, maybe that filtering might be more effective. Also, depending on the type of memory you have in that gyro versus on the board. There's different types of memory, and some are accessible faster, and maybe that low-pass filtering is more effective if you can do it closer, with the built-in memory in the gyro chip versus on the board. Now, I don't know. I honestly don't know if any of that is really making any kind of notable difference, but I know when you're looking at computers in the performance, like for gaming computers, things like that, those are factors you look at, and they do make a difference, but I'm not sure, in comparing like a gyro chip through versus the board processor, I'm not sure if that's going to make a big difference here. But anyway, something to consider. For people who know more about this stuff, hopefully you can jump in here and comment and say whether that's relevant. But I think there's more to come on these BMI gyros. I think they're certainly usable. In this one particular case, if everything is due to just the differences in the gyro, I think I would call the BMI270 a little cleaner down low, a little worse through the motor band, and a little better up high. But I think overall it's slightly more prone to little prop wash bobbles, making some trade-offs. Prop wash bobbles versus if you kind of increase the filtering a little bit. There's some trade-offs, but it's definitely a very usable gyro. I don't see problems here, and it may have some advantages over the MPU6000. Okay, my voice I think is done. Questions, comments, everything like that, put it in below. Let's have a good discussion. Let's and also, if you have boards, BMI270s that you can black box log on, please share your experiences so that we can get a bigger sample than my tiny sample of one BMI gyro here. Okay, till next time. Cheers.